Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my very great pleasure and privilege to chair what I'm sure, having spoken to the guys here, is going to be a really fascinating session around the power of champions, ambassadors, and the role that they play, that voluntary role that they play. Just before we kind of start that discussion off, a very quick reflection for me this morning. The word that came through again and again and again, I think, was that question of leadership. And really, this session is about the leadership that comes from people who don't necessarily sit at the top of the organisation, who don't necessarily have the most power, but who can play a vital role in changing the culture and atmosphere around this issue. And I know that each of the three have a really fascinating story to tell. So firstly, on my extreme left there, what's happening in British politics at the minute? You're on the extreme left.
You're correct, I am.
Yes. So we have Thorman, who's the enterprise architect in corporate banking at HSBC. And then we have Anushka Davies, who's head of talent, engagement and diversity at Softcat. And then finally, next to me, we have Nancy Lengthorn, who's head of diversity, inclusion and future talent at MediaCom. And Anushka, can we start off with you? I mean, Softcat's obviously a particular kind of organisation. Tell us a little about the challenges that you had in rolling out the programme that you do.
Yeah, so Softcat are an IT reseller that sits in what we call the IT channel, a very fast-paced organisation where new technologies are at the forefront, lots of salespeople in our organisation. We have 1,400 employees, of which 70% of them are men, and the majority of those men sit in our sales and specialist functions. So roles which mean very target-driven, like I said, fast-paced, end of the quarters aren't much fun for them. And I guess for me, it was a bit of a realisation a few years ago. I mean, I started at Softcat 19 years ago as a grad when we had about 50 employees. And our business model has kind of inherently stayed the same. So we recruit graduates and apprentices and kind of steer them along and get them to be as successful as they possibly can. But I also noticed that we had lots of mature people who were going through life-changing scenarios like financial difficulty, divorces, and all sorts, which made me start thinking about their welfare. And a lot of my own friends who I actually started with. So I guess initially, for us, it was starting to just get the conversation going. I wanted to get to a point where people were not being signed off sick and using things like viruses and kind of excuses really for being signed off sick for a week or 2 weeks, but to get to a point where we could comfortably talk openly about mental health. So we signed the Time to Change pledge 2 years ago, and kind of everything else just snowballed off the back of that. We all of our managers had to go through mental health training for managers, which was a half-day training. It was advocated by our CEO at the time as well, and it was mandatory, so people did get a telling off if they didn't attend. But that was more about kind of making sure that they had time to almost like take time out to just look at their teams every now and again and just kind of not be so focused on sales targets and just have the opportunity to have those conversations with their teams in a one-to-one environment just to check in on them. And then we raised lots of awareness campaigns off the back of that. All of our employees went through kind of mini workshops as well, and we still run that as part of our induction training as well.
Fantastic. And that awareness piece, kind of really raising the level of knowledge and understanding is a challenge that you faced in your organisation, Nancy. Tell us a little bit about that.
So we started about 3 years ago a Mental Health Allies programme, probably like a few people in the room, on the back of Johnny and Neil coming in and doing a talk about it. And we hadn't really had any conversations about mental health in the business prior to that. And as soon as that happened, it sort of opened a floodgate, really. And we had so many people contacting my team saying, that isn't all you're going to do, is it? And if I'm being really honest, that was all I was going to do. And I thought, God, we never have this response to things. So clearly there's some need in here, and we've got to do something about it. So we set up an Allies programme. Initially, when that launched, the role was relatively straightforward. I wouldn't say easy, but straightforward in that those people are there to listen without judgment, and then to signpost people to services and resources that we have that will support them. And we sort of went along with that for about a year, and it was really well received, embedded really quickly into the company, unlike anything else I've seen actually. But over time, I think the passion of those people, and I think some of that comes from what they're dealing with and how they're supporting people, that passion sort of led to them saying, what else can I do? Like, what more should we be doing? And so that Allies role, for probably about 50% of them, has now turned into more of an education and campaigning role. We have created a number of different videos that have been used internally and externally. We have hosted events. We've talked to industry, big industry forums. Those people, and they're all levels of the agency, they're, you know, the most junior people and the most, all the way through to the most senior, they will stand up at the beginning of team huddles, they will talk at departmental away days, and they're just sort of there constantly talking about it. And I think that that has been the thing that's really powerful. And it is incredibly important to have role modelling at CEO level and C-suite level, without doubt. But having what's essentially a little army of people who are there chipping away at this all the time and talking about this constantly has, I think, been the thing that's really made the difference, because they're on the ground talking about this with their teams and people around them all the time. And I think those constant sort of little hacks are the things that have really made a difference and taken us from something 3 years ago where we had never said the words out loud to now being a company where there are 60 people walking around in green lanyards, their faces are plastered everywhere, they're incredibly visible, they are referred to by senior management constantly. It's so part of the fabric of the agency. And I think it is because of those 60 people who've just made it their business to go off and reinforce this all day long.
That's fascinating. And that point you made about passion overcoming those barriers that exist there, people kind of thinking, you know, let's not go there. I mean, Mary, you're from the banking industry, and you've tried to institute a program that's pretty radical, really. So again, just tell us a bit about that, and be interesting to hear about some of the obstacles that you faced as you did this.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, great. Well, it's great to hear what people have been doing. So, apologies, I seem to have a cough, but. So yeah, mine's mindfulness. So quite specifically, mindfulness, not mental health in the round. Although obviously mindfulness does have massive implications for people's mental health. And really, it came from the passion of wanting to just do something that would help. Really, I came to mindfulness about 20 years ago when I was having panic attacks. And quite an enlightened GP kind of pointed out to me eventually, after I'd spent a year being a hypochondriac and saying it was everything that physical, nothing mental. I eventually got persuaded that it was actually a mental health issue, and she actually directed me to meditation, which was probably quite enlightened at the time. At that point, you couldn't really access mindfulness except through kind of Buddhist organizations, but they were very, very welcoming and open. I haven't become a Buddhist, haven't decided to do that, but always really chimed with me. And yeah, I guess wind forward another 10 years, I did that classic thing of embodying it whilst it helped me, but as soon as I felt better, I stopped doing it. And then when I came to Sheffield, which is where I work now at the HSBC, I started to burn out again. So my day job is I'm an IT architect, so I don't generally work in the sort of realms that you would expect somebody to do something around mental health. And working in a big bank during the global crisis, we weren't very popular. The atmosphere wasn't particularly great at times, and a huge workforce and an awful lot of transformation and change, has been going on ever since. Quite frankly, I don't expect it's going to change. So mindfulness, really, I guess for me, has always been something that helps me ground, helps me face change, and actually helps me, I guess, just realise that I always have a choice, you know, whatever's going on, whatever the bank might be doing to us or is happening in life, we always have a choice on how we respond to it. And it became obvious to me that actually, you know, that there were people struggling, absolutely, much as you guys, I'm sure, have seen, and it wasn't just me. So I decided to reach out. It was my coming out moment. Thought it might be an opportunity to share what I did with other colleagues and not feel so weird. And I've just been pleasantly surprised. So that was in 2011. And, you know, we're still here, just about. And it's grown organically. It's very much been a grounds-up kind of thing. So it's grassroots. The network is only there because people want to be part of it. It's entirely voluntary. There's 2,000 members now in the UK. We're training champions internally to try and basically just reach out where people want to understand mindfulness and actually introduce it into their workplace setting and into their day jobs. You know, we're training people internally to help do that. And we had a bit of a challenge about, do we do internal, do we do external? And, you know, I've had various heads of HR challenge me on that. And my answer generally is back to them. You can buy in expertise, absolutely, and you need to for mindfulness because it is a little bit more radical and the research is still building. But you can't change a culture from the outside, you know, so if you want to change and make a real meaningful, lasting change and embed this, then it has to be the people internally who are really driving that. And so that's what we've done. We've got 30 people trained in 2017, which was a very innovative pilot at the time. We're part of the government's all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness in the workplace, so we've you know, been working hand in hand with them and really some of the leaders in the industry on this, and we're feeling our way through it. I guess there isn't a template really here for us at the moment, which is exciting, but also a little bit nerve-wracking at times. And we've constantly have to knock on people's doors and sort of say, this is what we're doing, and inevitably now, because it is getting such a groundswell, we needed that backing at the top, which thankfully we've got. I think time for change and these other great initiatives have really helped. But ultimately, it's the people who are making it happen, and that's for me the loveliest thing. I've got my community that I was aiming to get, and it's still going. So.
Great, thank you so much, all of you. One of the things that seems to have come out, which is common, albeit different in each of your scenarios, is that quite thorny philosophical question of what's the responsibility of the employer, what then becomes the responsibility of the champion or the ambassador or the advocate or whichever term it is you use, and where does that responsibility kind of begin and end? And I think you talked in your sections here about people's passion, wanting to do more, but potentially that can become a bit risky, can't it? Is that something that you've encountered?
Yeah, we have. I think, first of all, a couple of people have probably tried to get involved who maybe it isn't the right time for them to be involved, and that's a difficult conversation to have with them. But I think also we're really clear about our Allies programme. They're not counsellors, and we have posters and vinyls and loads of things all over the building, everywhere, that really clearly spells out what their role is. They are not there to fix, they're not there to come up with advice or solutions. That's the absolute antithesis of what they're supposed to do. And when people come and see our allies, they make it quite clear that it's also not necessarily confidential. So I think sometimes people think, well, I can come and tell you absolutely anything and it goes no further. But that would be such a dangerous thing to do. So we make it really clear that I am here to support you. But actually, if you're really going to support people, and we have had this situation where people are in a very dark place and have been suicidal, the most dangerous thing and the worst thing I could do for you is to keep this confidential. Yeah. So it doesn't, what you say to me, of course I will be incredibly discreet. And in many cases, what you're saying is confidential because it's it's a bad week at work or it's something that's going on at home and there's not any reason to escalate that. But the allies are trained to understand that there are certain things to watch out for, there's certain language that you need to be mindful of. And if you hear or see those things, then you escalate it. But you need to be clear with that person that may happen. You may say something to me that is really serious, and I may have to go and do something about it.
But that confidentiality kind of works in both directions as well, doesn't it? Because the person who is the ambassador or the advocate may be hearing things that they have to be very careful about how they communicate that with. And it's a bit of a risk, isn't it, if you get the person with, how shall I put this, not quite the right mindset and professionalism to do that role.
Yeah. I think there's a few lessons that we learnt when we first really started to get the ball rolling with mental health, was that we launched an opportunity for people to put their names forward to become a mental health first aider. And the plan was to make sure that we had a couple per office. So we've got eight locations, one per office or two per office, and also cross-functional. So, making sure that all areas of the business, and also gender split as well. And I only wanted to have 12 at the time initially and see how that went. And I chose the most enthusiastic 12 and kind of shot myself in the foot further down the line, because actually those 12 people, had I actually had a better conversation with them, I kind of established that some of those people were putting their names forward because they were going through a mental health journey of their own and they wanted to try and help other people, but yet they hadn't quite helped themselves yet. So I learnt the hard way on that one. So the second time round, when we wanted to reinvest in some more mental health first aiders, because there were lots of employees wanting to have some time with them, I was a little bit more rigorous in my approach. So I actually asked the people to put their names forward. And at the time, they were only for 4 different locations. I had 56 people put their names forward, and I interviewed every single one of them. And when I say interview, not face-to-face, it wasn't kind of a long, drawn-out process, but a telephone interview with them just to ask them why they wanted to be a mental health first aider.
And sorry to interrupt, I mean, if any of the audience here were putting themselves in the same position, is there anything that you think, having gone through it twice, that you would say is an absolute kind of red flag, something that if you think you hear, that person possibly isn't yet in the position that they should be doing that role?
Definitely, if they are going through a mental health journey of their own, irrespective of what it is, whether they've got a family member who is going through a mental health journey, which is why they want to do it, or they have been through stress and anxiety, or been through some kind of scenario of their own. When I say absolute red flag, it depends where they are in that journey. If they have come to a point where they are coping well with it, that's different. But timing's really right on that one. The other one is also, I actually told them the kind of scenarios we were dealing with, because I think statistically, because of the more common mental health illnesses, you'll think stress, anxiety, depression are the ones that we'll face. But actually, I was so wrong on that as well. When you're dealing with people who might have suicidal thoughts, or actually in those kind of scenarios, they're really, really hard. I mean, we've had to go and kind of run after people because we know that they're going to go and do some self-harm. And, those are really awkward scenarios. So if I asked them that question and their response was that they were going to try and fix them, again, that's not quite the right approach. It's, again, what you've just said, Nancy, about being in a position where you can be non-judgmental and you can signpost people to the right places, because you cannot physically fix a person. Yeah.
And Mari, I mean, something I've heard quite a bit is, perhaps amongst people who are a bit more cynical in this audience, who I'm sure are wonderful, but that accusation that gets levelled against organisation, that you put in these things, these schemes, and they're a bit of a cipher, actually. They're really there to prevent us tackling the more complex issues, but what's really happening in the workplace culture, it's just a bit of, in the same way that we have greenwashing, it's just a bit of cover to not tackling the deeper underlying issues. Is that something you've encountered, and is there something you have to do when developing a programme like you've done to get over that?
Yeah, I think I was very, very mindful of the term muck mindfulness that has been out there in the media, particularly around corporates, I guess, jumping on the bandwagon. And it has become a bit of a fad. And we've had plenty of people approach us as a big bank, where they see the dollar signs, and I'm sure many of them are very, very great mindfulness teachers, but very few of them will have done it in a corporate environment because there wasn't the training, quite frankly, which I knew. So, Yeah, I was very concerned about that mindfulness accusation, which I take as, two things. You're papering over the cracks. So rather than solving the actual problems that people are, potentially experiencing at work that might be not helping them with their mental health, you kind of just give them this thing and then off they go. And you almost put the responsibility for solving it on them, and that's obviously not a great thing. But the second thing was to just, by just rolling this out, just to say we've fixed every problem that there ever could be. And clearly mindfulness isn't going to just fix everything. For me, what it really does is empower people to make their own decisions and become much more self-aware of how they are. So yeah, we've got a charter, and our charter was, we will make it secular, so we wanted to make it inclusive to everybody. We didn't particularly want to go down the religious route, so obviously there's lots of spiritual elements that you can go down with mindfulness. We wanted it to be research-driven, so big piece of our program is we research it, we do it pre and post for all of the kind of programs that we do, because we want to contribute back to the wider world, but also we wanted to make sure, for our return on investment and our KPIs and all of these buzzwords, that we can actually prove to our management, why this is the right thing to do. And, we got a return of investment in terms of just events that people could run following our additional training within 4 months of 75%. So I think it was a no-brainer, really. So the money isn't significant in terms of the impacts. But the other piece that really concerns me, and this is where we are at the moment, is so we're training people, that's great, we've got some great enthusiastic people, they need to embody it, so that's my red flag. If they're not an embodied mindfulness practitioner themselves, then I think we're potentially going to struggle. But with the best will in the world, you can have all of the enthusiasm, but if you don't have the right support to actually do this within your line management, then potentially we're going to set people up to fail. So my thing that I started was, we'll do this as long as it doesn't cause me or anyone else stress, and if it helps one person, it was worth doing. So we've certainly helped one person. It has come close to causing me stress, quite frankly. And literally just April this year, I was very close to pressing the button to say we need to stop. And that's about looking at getting the proper HR policies and support for the time that people need to invest in.
Well, let's explore that a bit more, because one of the questions that's just come up here, as you can see, is allies and champions have day jobs, busy getting on with the doing. How do you balance that with the additional responsibility of supporting others? What are your experiences of that?
I tend to, so with our mental health first aiders, we have set some guidelines across our group. So yes, we treat every incident confidentiality with confidence, but at the same time, please feel free to talk about the scenario. And so I'm deliberately not a mental health first aider openly at work, because I feel like I've got more value to add when it comes to positioning it well enough with the directors, the leadership team, and the board. But I look at my job as looking after the mental health first aiders, if that makes sense. So I will pull people out of their role as a mental health first aider if I think it's just getting too much for them. So some of the scenarios that might be dealing with, I've had to pull one out a couple of weeks ago because, she was calling me up quite regularly for some advice, and I just thought, this is getting a little bit too much for you. So I was like, just have a little bit of a break, have a quarter off, have 6 months off.
And how did she take that?
And she was fine, but actually I think she was really relieved. I actually gave her the option because it is coming from such a good place and they want to help people, they feel like they have to do it on their own sometimes. And I'm like, actually, you're not. There's 17 mental health first aiders at the moment. So, pass it on to somebody else. It's fine. So I think she was quite relieved that I pulled her out of it, to be honest. So I see that as my role. But also, like work commitments can get really busy in different stretches. So again, I've just tried to be as flexible as I can. So if you're having a quarter where, I don't know, you're working on a massive project and your capacity is really thin, just tell me and we'll dip you out so that, other people can help instead.
But I think as well, it's really important that those people are they're not counsellors, so you shouldn't be going back over and over and over again to that person. They are people to listen and to signpost. And so if you do have, and we have had this situation, if you have somebody who's repeatedly going back to somebody, again, it's not the kindest thing to do for them, because they then start to become reliant on that relationship.
Yeah.
They're then sort of needing that person to validate everything that they're doing, and that's a really unhealthy place to be. So we have to be quite strict about allies being lent on too much.
Yeah.
And if I think that that's happened, then I tend to intervene in that situation, and then I will speak to the person and say, how can we support you in a more fundamental way?
Yeah.
Because clearly you need some real support. Let's look at something else. So I think if the balance tips and they are thinking, I cannot cope with this workload, then something's gone wrong. That shouldn't really be happening.
And there's a question there which, in a sense, leads on from that around, there's two really around training. How do you, question about being more holistic, what do you do in terms of prevention, but also how specific does the training need to be, accredited courses? This is probably a good moment for me to do an advertisement and say, come and speak to us at the Mental Health UK stand. We do lots of training for managers and so on. I would have got shot if I hadn't mentioned that, so there we go. But I mean, in terms of the actual training programs themselves, and they're quite different, obviously, mindfulness in one end. What have you done in terms of accreditation, or are these entirely things that you've developed in-house?
We use external people because I think it's, you know, we're not mental health professionals, and so it would be ludicrous to sort of come up with our own content around that. So the allies go through a 2-day program. A lot of that is about mental health itself. Some of it is about what the allies program should look like so that it fits our culture. And that would be one thing that I would really recommend, because just picking something off the shelf and just thinking it has to look exactly like this in our building is a mistake. But then I think as an organisation, and slightly in reference to your earlier question about things looking like you're just doing it as a token gesture, everything we do around mental health and inclusion full stop is about education or action. And if it isn't punchy, then we're just not doing it. And I think that a lot of the training we do now, some of it's very specific about mental health. Other bits of training are much broader, but it's about pulling people who might not go to mental health training into that conversation. So we've done things like sleep workshops, digital detoxing, things that will just start to pull a wider group in to then get them to engage, and then hopefully come up with things, you know, they can create the right foundations for good mental health. So it's not just about fixing the issues when they crop up, but you have to tap into the experts, because we do media, and it would be silly to think that we were the experts in this.
Have I mentioned video training? I don't know if I covered that. I mean, did you have a similar kind of challenge there, Mike?
I think our challenge is different, because I agree, you know, where there's expertise, it'd be crazy not to use it. And we've got mental health first aiders going on at HSBC now, which is great. But the mindfulness, as I say, it just didn't really exist. There are plenty of companies, GSK, EY, etc., who are doing great things. And we've almost formed a little mentoring group between us, really, to try and sort of take best practice and work out, you know, how maybe this can become more of a standardized thing. So the focus for us was awareness first and foremost, education, and then practice. So we try and focus our training and our offerings, if you like, on those three things. The training itself, I guess I've put myself through quite a lot of clinical-based training, so MBSR type courses, MBCT, .B, which is the mindfulness in schools. I've done some Zen Way, so to try and give myself a broadest experience of how different people train. So I feel reasonably comfortable that I've got a good sense of that. And then the company that we work with is Kalapa, a kind of, you know, the leading edge company doing this with corporates, and they're based out of Germany. But we just came up with a 4-level. So I think much as the mental health, you know, we've got promoters, so people who go through their own sort of 6-week course around the foundations of mindfulness, how it can apply in the workplace. That's very much for them, you know. So this is you go. Hopefully, you know, you can either get something out of it for yourself. If you then want to kind of explore going further and helping others, great. We call those promoters. The next level is Facilitator. That's really a much more in-depth training, which takes people off-site and really sort of takes you through the practice of how you lead a session, what you might do if you have bad reactions from people, general Q&A. And we've got some fairly standard presentations and materials around the neuroscience that people can use, to take out to different team tasters and introductory talks and things, so they go down well. And then the next level up, we're just piloting now, and we're calling that leader, and that's to train some of us that have already gone through those 2 levels to lead that 6-week foundation course, and hopefully that will keep it much more self-sustaining. But there's challenges at all those levels in terms of the effort, the time, and there is no formal accreditation, but we're kind of working with the government group just to try and make sure we've got the best practice we can.
And you've brought up the subject of levels, and it's interesting if you look at the title of this session. We've got ambassadors, champions, advocates, allies, friends. People might get a bit bewildered. I mean, do you see any difference between these things, or are they just names that company A happens to choose over company B? If you're an advocate, is that different from being a champion? What are the differences between these things in your view?
I suspect there are differences, but I think it's confusing. So HSBC, quite honestly, is in a bit of a muddle at the moment with, we've got champions for everything. We've got ambassadors, we've got allies. And they're all great. That's not to belittle what they're doing, but I don't think it's clear from the title what is the expectation. Which is kind of like, although we've got champion, but we've tried to go into our own kind of, this is what these levels mean, be very clear about what's expected of them, but also, if you want to request a session, these are the sorts of things that you can get back. But I'm sure you guys have.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for us, one of the first things is that mental health first aiders shouldn't just be a tick in the box exercise for employers as well, because it's quite easy just to go, well, do you know what, we'll just train up X amount of mental health first aiders and kind of that'll do. Because the mental health first aiders can't do their job, and when I say their job, on top of their job, without everybody else around them in their company actually being aware of mental health and being advocates as well. Whether that be, you're an ally or a champion or an advocate, whatever that might be. One of the frustrations for me is that we don't want to get to a point where people just throw a problem over the fence to a mental health first aider. Hence why, for us, we're a company which really focuses on company culture. So it's our responsibility as managers, as leaders, to be able to have an open conversation. So that is one of the reasons why they all went through training. So they didn't just pass it over the fence and get to a point where they can have a decent level conversation and then signpost them to a mental health first aider if it gets a bit too much.
Yeah. I said to the folks here that beforehand we'd try and put a little bit of provocation into this, just, so it doesn't look like everything was easy. And there's a great question here. Some of our senior managers just don't get it.
Yep.
Yeah, we're all here because we believe, but some senior managers just don't get it. Do you have any tips to help with this? How do you make somebody just doesn't get it? And, how do you get the mindset from somebody who's very unwilling to engage in this issue, who happens to have that level of seniority? And I think that's something we can probably all relate to.
Yeah, for me it's about the training. So we made all senior leadership go on the training, and there were definitely some people who were a bit eye-rolly about it. That's the polite way of describing their behaviour.
What's the impolite way? But bearing in mind...
I feel like this might be recorded, so I'm not going to go further than that. Yeah. But putting them on that training, I think, really helped them to understand quite how serious it is, and also the different ways that their life is already being touched by this stuff. Yeah. So, I cannot find I cannot think of a single person where you just think you are in this bubble when none of this stuff is affecting you and it's absolutely okay. And when you give them the, information is power, and you give that to people and you start to get people to come round. And interestingly for me, I think there were a couple of people who were pretty cynical, and every time the training came up, it was like, oh, I can't, damn it, again, my diary's not okay. And we really pushed them on it, and we made them go. And then a few months down the line, then they'll come and say, actually, I've got some stuff going on at home with my partner. And you think, okay, mate. Yeah. And I think sometimes that resistance occasionally looks like resistance, but it also might be someone who just thinks, I cannot engage with this. I do not want to be this vulnerable at work, and I don't want to do it.
It's fascinating on that question, because I was speaking at the National Business Awards 2 weeks ago, and it's, it's a huge event at the Grosvenor Hotel, and I partly because I didn't know I was speaking until about 2 minutes beforehand, which was talk about stress and mental health. And I asked the audience, just to, to chew up a bit of time, really, who in this room does not know somebody who's got a serious mental health problem? And not a single hand went up. So that speaks to your point, doesn't it? That probably most people are affected by it, but maybe it's a bandwidth, or it's a confidence question, Anushka.
Yeah, probably. I mean, like, if 1 in 4 people are statistically likely to have a mental health issue, you either have a friend or a work colleague or a partner or family member who is suffering. Whether that person is talking about it or not is a different case. But if you have had some kind of training not necessarily as a senior manager, just as a normal human being, you're more likely to be aware of some changes that might happen in people. We've got somebody at work who suddenly started to dress immaculately. And we were like, whoa, that's a bit,
somebody like that.
bit odd. And it turns out they're going through some kind of personal issues, and they've chosen to hide it by kind of going the other way and spending loads of money on dressing amazingly well. And kind of, there's different things that might just trigger. And if you haven't been through some of this kind of training, you're just not aware. So it's just kind of open your eyes.
I had an incident, and just in the lifts where we walk, actually, the other day, there's a very kind of clear protocol in this building. It's known as charity towers. I think we've got a few organisations, voluntary sector organisations. Maybe somebody works there. But suffice to say that the deal is that you get in a queue and then you join that lift in order. And this particular person just bars right past me. Now, frankly, 4 or 5 years ago, I might have given them that kind of mean stare, might even have said something to them. But actually what they did is they went right to the back of the lift and they stood like that. The building is 15 floors, just to put this in perspective. So I realised, actually, this is probably somebody who's terrified of getting in a lift. And my rush to judgment actually would have made that person feel worse. So I do wonder if buried within that question, sometimes senior managers don't get it because they don't have the confidence and they don't want to look as the leader like they are actually struggling.
And that's the beauty of mental health training for anyone who is remotely worried about it. The second you go on that training, it isn't rocket science. And once you learn that there isn't the perfect script of what you're supposed to say, you just feel so empowered after that. And so that's why we made them. We forced them to do lots of things. But that was one where it was like, you absolutely have to go on this. So you will feel far less stressed and vulnerable about these conversations if you know what words that you should or shouldn't use.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one last question. What's the single thing that you would do differently? And what's been the single best success of these programmes?
You go first.
I was going to answer the management one, but just quickly on that one though. But so there are, for mindfulness, there is a business case book out there now. If you go on the Mindfulness Initiative site, you can find that and download it. That's had lots of people contribute to it. The other thing I found with senior management is, business cases, all of those things, return on investment, if they're not emotionally engaged in it, the business side of them might be. And, there's lots of clear business cases around these sorts of things right now. So that might be another way of trying to address that. So what would I do differently? Biggest success for me has been, I guess, going on the roller coaster, sticking with it, being quite tenacious, I guess, in the sense of, I had a vision. But the success was just how quickly people came along on the journey. So it hasn't been me, this isn't me. This is a whole group of people that have done this and are continuing to do it and now want to take it globally. That's the reason it's happening. So that's a big success for me. What would we do differently?
In a word? In a word?
I really don't know. I think
that was 4, but I'm going to let you off.
I would, what would I do differently? All I'd do differently is make, we did launch an internal forum page where people can post their own personal stories. And actually our CEO did his own, and quite senior managers have done their own as well. And all I would have done is done that a lot sooner, because I think that would have accelerated the fact that everyone's actually got something to share in terms of their story. And I think that kind of really does ramp it up. So everything that if you can, I guess, get people internally to share their own personal stories, that does really help.
Fantastic. Nancy?
I would have tried to engage with men on this much sooner than we did. So I think probably at the beginning we were quite gentle and we're hoping they'd just turn up. They don't turn up. Our events were about 5% male attendance. And so we've had to do things that we've sort of tried to trick them, really. So we've had sports people, we've had,
We're such simple
had
souls,
to lure
aren't we?
them in.
If you find food and beer, that usually does the job.
So I would have got on top of that much quicker. I thought if we talked about it, they'll come. They don't.
Great. We're out of time. I want to very quickly, in 10 seconds, having said to be provocative, finish off with the C word, maybe 5 actually. Feels to me like we've talked about choice, getting the right people, making them realise it's not mandatory. Capacity, do they have the capacity, the intellectual capacity, the time to do this? Mm-hmm. Clarity, do they know what the role is? Do they know where the role stops? Confidentiality, it works both ways. And communication, making sure that people actually know what's going on. So, having ended on that slightly cheeky note, can I just ask you to give us a warm round of applause for our fantastic speakers, Nancy, Anushka and Mary.